In this section, we're going to be talking about the Peloponnesian War. So, what happens in the first half of the 5th century BCE was the unity of the Greeks. It was astonishing. They had political success, they had sparked cultural achievement, but by the end, there's a lot of disunity. It became crashing down. And part of this was and this actually leads to the end of the classical period with the Peloponnesian War and subsequent the trial and execution of Socrates, as we had talked about in a different lecture. So by mid-century of the 5th century, Athens was the height of its power. It was controlled more than 200 cities. It was increasingly arrogant. It had imperialistic behavior, and it resented the other Greeks, and particularly its rival coalition, which is the Peloponnesian League under Sparta. In 431 BC, the situation had a bit kind of reminiscent of World War One, where both Athens allies and Spartan allies came into conflict, and both states, as heads of the proxy states, had to provide military aid and cause mobilization of both Athenian and Spartan armies. And this, with the mobilization of both leagues, the war ultimately broke out and lasted for about 30 years and involved the entire Greek world. The Athenians entered the war with a superior navy, and also with the confidence that they were, with the confidence and abilities that they were going to be successful. They had more money than Sparta. They had a superb fleet, and they had a great leadership with Pericles. Their main assets were sorry, and whereas in Sparta had, yes, a great an army, but they were seclusionists. They were not very wealthy, and they didn't have a navy at all. And they had a lot of resentment to the Athenians. And so, because of how they were within unification and how the Athenians wanted, Pericles understood the strength of Athens. He understood that they had a great navy, and that what they should do in his entire fighting strategy against the Spartans was, if they just protected themselves within Athenian walls, within their impenetrable walls, and only fought a naval battle, they would last longer and they would outlast Sparta and the funds Sparta could produce. And so they would just kind of bring the death of Sparta from economic ways. In the first year of the war, both Sparta and in the first year of the war, Sparta immediately invaded Athenian territory. The Athenians went inside their walls, and they followed Pericles' counsel and said that let's refuse to fight them. So the Spartans ended up marching back and forth along the walls. They burned some farms, but since they couldn't break through the walls, they were helpless. And in turn, Athens sent out a giant fleet, which sailed to Peloponnese, and they conducted little raids against the Spartans. They burned a few things, then retreat back on the ships before the Spartans arrived. And so kind of was a stalemate. As one historian described it, as an elephant fighting a whale at war. Each was more comfortable in their own domain. And so this kind of led into a big stalemate where that would just continually happen. In 430 BCE, the entire Athenian population crammed inside the city. A plague broke out, and which killed more than a fourth of their populace, and unfortunately including Pericles. And this created a leadership vacuum. And so different groups known as demagogues tried to stir up with vocal skills and stuff to get the people's emotion. And the most prominent of this demagogue was Cleon, who eventually convinced the Athenians to abandon Pericles' tragedy, which was one of the many misfortunes Cleon does. Cleon scored a significant military coup when he captured a large amount of Athenian soldiers, and given that Spartan soldiers, he captured a lot of Spartan soldiers, and given the Spartan manpower shortage. This was very desperate. The war seemed to be turning in the favor of Athens. However, Spartan came up with a new leader named Brasidas. And Brasidas decided the best way for Sparta to defeat Athens was to cut it off from its resources. So in 424, Brasidas seized the town of Amphipolis. And that is where the big Athenian silver mines were. And Cleon led his army back up to recapture Amphipolis. And what ends up happening is it results in this indecisive battle where both Cleon and Brasidas were both killed. So most of the pro-war leaders on each side were gone, and it was like nearly 10 years of fighting, and then they had a brief truce. In this truce, Athens got back Amphipolis, and Sparta regained its soldiers. So the middle years of the war. As soon as these new demagogues emerged and caused the war to resume. In particular, a talented young man from a good family named Alcibiades came to power in Athens. And he was very charismatic. He was attractive. Like, everyone talked about his hair being attractive and how good looking he was. And he was an amazing speaker. Apparently he could talk people into doing anything. But at the same time, he was impulsive. He was obnoxious. He enjoyed drinking and spending money on luxuries. And in 415, Alcibiades began urging Athenians to undertake a Sicilian military expedition. Now, Pericles had said, don't expand the borders in the middle of the war. You don't want multiple wars. But Alcibiades said he could decisively win the war. And the Sicilian expedition was called for expanding the empire into the Mediterranean to conquer the powerful city of Syracuse in the island of Sicily and control it. Now, what happens? The night before Alcibiades leaves, a number of herms were mutilated. Now, a herm is a tall stone column that has a head of a god on the top, a head of Hermes on the top, and it has a large protruding stone erection. And I really mean an erection, erect penis. So it's a head with a column and an erect penis. And they were considered, they were out in front of all the homes to ward away evil. Well, apparently, someone in the middle of the night went around to a whole bunch of herms and knocked off their genitalia. Now, this was seen as a sacrilegious act, and the suspicion fell on Alcibiades and his friends, who had been heavily drinking the night before. So the Athenians were afraid to outright accuse him when he had the army. So what they did is the Athenian Senate allowed them to leave. And as soon as they left, they called him back to stand trial, because you had to be in Athens to stand trial. And so he goes to go back to Athens. He realizes he's going to be assassinated, and so he flees to Sparta and becomes the advisor for the Spartan king. Now, Alcibiades' replacement was a cautious, superstitious, alien old man named Nicetas. Now, Nicetas had a kidney problem, and he was on his deathbed pretty much. And so the Athenians tried, under Nicetas, to capture Syracuse in vain. And they kept doing it, and they would go into one place and get, it was just really hopeless. And so everyone was urging Nicetas to come home. But unfortunately, on the eve that they were about to sail out, a lunar eclipse came up. Nicetas was worried that this was a bad omen and said they had to wait for a period of 3 times 9 days, essentially a month, before they retreated. However, by the time they could retreat, they were completely surrounded, and the Sicilians, the Syracusans, end up slaughtering all the Greeks or capturing them. They capture a few, throw them down in the mine pit, and the only people that are really able to survive are Athenians who could recite the newest plays, because the Syracusans loved Athenian plays. So they kept in mind the only people who had memorized the plays. And so this kind of abruptly ends the Athenian War. And what happens is that Athens has to surrender. Their army, their navy is pretty much decimated. Their armies are decimated. And 404, Athens does an unconditional surrender. And what happens during this? It imposes that this treaty, the destruction of the long walls around Athens are completely destroyed. It limits the Athenians to only having 12 ships. It dismantles democracy. And instead, what happens is Sparta appoints 30 tyrants as the new government. So these are rulers with absolute authority. And so what happens is a lot of tyranny that happens during the time. There's a culture war that happens between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, who have very different ways of life. And this is really the disillusionment of Athens. It's a time of culture war. There's traditionalists who blame the democracy. There's the sophists or defeat with the execution of Socrates. You have a return to traditional attitudes and religions and values. And really, at the same time, even though Athens wins, they kind of lose. Because Sparta wins, they kind of lose. Because Spartans don't have the means to rule this. They are losing funding. Everything disintegrates at this time. And on top of this, everything's going on during these culture wars is you have a group called the Seekers of Ill Fortune, and these are anti-traditionalists. And so they go around, they go like, if there is existence of God, lightning will strike. Oh, lightning didn't strike, so I guess God doesn't exist. And they go around performing shocking sacrilegious acts that just appall most Athenians and Spartans alike. And so this is kind of by the end of the 5th century, where you had the height at the beginning and people were thinking different things, by the end, it's completely destroyed. And chaos is ruling among the Greek city-states. So this is the end of the Peloponnesian War.